Hello everybody, welcome to this first video on the empire, the British complexity of its empire. And well, I bought this DVD right here, and this DVD narrated by Jeremy Paxman is actually the one that I'm going to be talking about in these videos. There's a lot to unpack, so I think I'm going to divide this section into 5 segments or 5 videos, 5 short videos, basically explaining each hour. The documentary is on the Britain Empire, mainly during its height, which is during the Victorian era or the Victorian age, from I think more or less 1820 to the beginning of the 20th century, like 1901, 1915, around there. I would say right before the First World War. And in this video, they talk about a lot of things, but the documentary kind of surprised me because it doesn't really focus on, I thought it was going to be more of a documentary talking about the origin of the British Empire, how England came to be, right? Basically from Rome, from the barbarians. I once had a friend explain to me how the Romans, throughout history, like actually ended up being the Americans that are now in the United States. But yeah, I thought it was gonna be like a full timeline and that it was gonna have like a sequential order. It doesn't really have an order. We start out with India in 1763 talking about the Madras Regiment. The Madras Regiment is very interesting. And okay, that's the way I'm going to. I took notes while I was watching the the video, the documentary, and that's basically how we're going to handle these short videos. I'm going to be talking about the main ideas that they talk about during each of these hours. It's a 5-hour documentary, and so this is everything that is seen in the first hour. They start talking about India, and then I'm going to be talking about other ideas that they eventually talk about beforehand, maybe, but then we'll get into them as the videos progress. Okay, so they start with India, and I was kind of like, why do they start with India? Because I was like, was India the most affected by the British? And there's a special relationship between the British and the Indians. And for me, I basically view it as, and they kind of imply this throughout the documentary, that in Britain, they were very traditional, they were very organized, orderly, and India was kind of more this this diversity place, right, where it was chaotic, it was interesting, it was I heard once someone told me that someone that traveled to India, I had a teacher, and he told me that India was very intense. Everything was very intense, like intense flavors, visually intense, auditory, and like to the senses, it's intense, right? And they mentioned that India becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire, which is, there's a map, which I'm going to show in this video, but it's basically of all the territories in the world that the British Empire had. So they had territories obviously in the 13 colonies, in South America, Jamaica, Canada. They had territories all over Africa, Kenya, South Africa. They even at one point they even had control of Egypt, Cairo, Egypt. They had control of I said India, Hong Kong, Singapore. I think even some of the Arab nations, like they came to control a lot in the world. And you could say that they're basically like the first world empire. And there's a time called Pax Britannica, and Pax Britannica was basically the era, more or less between the 1800s and the 1900s, I believe. And Pax Britannica, yeah, 1850 to 1914, which is kind of there with the Victorian era of 1820 to 1901, more or less, which is when Queen Victoria died. Okay, but let's go back to India. So in India, they paid local soldiers to fight for them. Since the British were far away, it's a small island. So what the British would do is like, okay, we have enemy in India. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna hire locals, train them, and have them fight the Indians, right? So it was, I believe it was a different type of warfare, like more sophisticated. The colonization era, I think, wasn't all that like, I mean, it was brutal, but it wasn't like head on warfare like it had been in previous years, where it was like one army versus one army. I mean, these were more sophisticated. I would even call them like manipulation tactics. Not everybody, I mean, the British Empire idea is complex. It's not pretty straightforward. You can't say they were good, they were bad, because there were a lot of people, and it was a long time. It was like 200, 300 years from the 1600s when it started all the way to like the end towards the end of the 60s is when it kind of finished, because a lot of colonies gained their independence. But the Madras Regiment is still active to today. It was founded in 1758, and yeah, it was basically the Indians fighting for the British. Right now, I think Britain, being small and being an island, naturally has this inclination towards the sea, towards navigation, maybe even towards exploration, because we have to remember that how do you control most of the world if you can't get to it, right? So these people were out there. They were in Africa, they were in Singapore, they had officials out there, basically. And there's this thing called the British bluff, so which I think is kind of tied to the Magician Act. They talk about this at one point where they had like communities of thousands, like in Africa or wherever, and there were like 100 British men, right? So at any moment, if the communities really wanted to, they could overpower the British officials, no problem, no questions asked. But it was a bluff. It was this idea of like, we're spectacular, we're high and mighty, right? The way they dressed, the way they probably conducted themselves. So, but it was a bluff at the end of the day. And they talk about, you know, uh, the first Indian War of Independence, which happened in May 1857, which was before Gandhi. And yeah, because India doesn't get their independence until after World War II. But in Lucknow, the Indians attack the British. So this is basically where they're trying to shatter that myth, right? That myth of like, the British are all high and mighty and powerful, right? So they start to like test them, right? And there were a lot of wars during these times, with obviously the local natives that didn't want to be ruled, right, or that were being taken advantage of. So yeah, there's another interesting idea, which was the Maharaja. The Maharaja, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, is the product of both cultures. It's a product of British and Indian culture, and this is basically the leader of the Indian people, or the local Indian people, the local tribes, right? Where they were basically promised like power and influence over their people, but really the people behind it, moving and pulling the strings, were the British, right? So at the end of the day, they were stripped of all their power, but they were able to keep their palaces, right? There's also the viceroy. The viceroy was the British ruler in India, and he was Pump, right? And I think that word's funny. Like they display importance, right? Like they're all high and mighty and powerful, but they're really not, right? They're just another mortal human that could be killed at any moment. And there's this whole debate, like the first hour too, well, towards the end, of whether this colonization was good or bad, whether it benefited people, or whether the atrocities committed. And it's a complex thing, because it was hundreds of years, like 200, 300, and there were many characters, good and bad characters, from the British Empire. So and also from the local areas. So there's no clear cut answer. Like, was it good? Was it bad? You could say in general, it's not a good idea. It's not a Christian idea even to try to get other people to do your will, right? Which was basically what the British were doing. So that idea is not good. But then there's another idea, right? A sub idea from that, which is like if the people are in dire need or they need help and you see that you're able to provide that help, right, like education or food or whatever, then you should aid them, right? So it's kind of like a complex thing. Okay, and then for this they talk about the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal was built by the British. A lot of things came from the British, like the Boy Scouts too, and it makes sense because they're explorers. They were explorers, so it makes sense that they founded an explorer enterprise, right? And yeah, they basically made Queen Victoria like Empress of India. They say that India was one of the best British colonies. And in 1897 was when the British were at the height of their power, a power jubilee. Um, Now, yeah, they were in Cairo in Egypt, and this surprised me too, because you could say, well, what the hell are they doing in Egypt? In September 1882, the British invade Cairo, Egypt, for the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was a way for them to get to India through that area instead of, I guess, going around Africa or cutting through the Arab nations. So they were able to go through the Suez Canal because they needed to get tea, cotton, and jute, which is rope. So basically, they were involved in trading, right? Like moving things from one place to the other, manufacturing, but not only things, but people, right? Like, and not only slaves, like literally, like I'm gonna mention in hour two, they moved. They would gather Indians from India and take them to Africa to work on the lunatic rail or the lunatic railway, right? Like they were moving people around to work too. So it was like a major company, right? Okay, well, Egypt was controlled from what is now the British Embassy. So what the British Embassy is now in Egypt, that's where they used to control it. And there were diplomats and imperialists like Sir Evelyn Baring, which they made the Egyptians think they were in power, right? Again, like in India, and then this was kind of like their MO throughout all of their colonies, right? Like they would get there, they would make the people that were there think that they were in charge, but they were the ones that were really pulling the strings, like I mentioned. And the imperialist mentality is trying to expand this geographical and political influence, and that's what they were doing behind the curtains, right? So they didn't give commands, they say at one point in the documentary, but they gave advice that should be taken or that could not be ignored, right? Which I think is kind of an elegant way of saying like you're gonna do what I'm telling you to do, right? Um, so yeah, this makes me think about many things like who came up with the ideas of embassies, diplomats, right? Where you do have embassies in each country from other countries, and how much influence are they really, exercising over the governors of those areas still to this day, right? So yeah, there are ways to keep direct foreign influences, or are they ways to keep for direct foreign influence, right? It's a question. Excuse me. And for example, is the U.S. nowadays like a Britain proxy state, right? That's also like a question that I have. Okay, well, the last section of this hour talks about World War I and Palestine. And right now there's that's been going on for a while, but the Palestinians have been fighting the Jewish for over, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of years, or maybe just a couple decades. Um, but it's very interesting because they talk about this here, and you kind of get a feel of what may have caused this, because we all know it's a territorial dispute for the Holy Land, right? For Jerusalem, where we actually have like four religions there at the moment, and they're all just like, well, the Arabs and the Jewish are fighting each other. But this goes back, I think, to the territory thing, at least goes back to the British in World War I, where they fought the Turkish, and they actually needed the Arabs to fight Turkish people. So this is explained with Thomas Edward Lawrence, and he was a dashing imperialist because he actually lived with the Arabs right? And basically they promised the Palestinians, or they promised Palestine to the Arabs. This, I think, was with the Sykes and Picot Agreement. And yeah, the British enter the Holy Land, Jerusalem, in December 11th, 1917, which was during World War One. And they promised the promised land, basically, to the Arabs, right? They think that the British think, with their empire, that by entering the Holy Land, it's kind of like and their religious values and virtues, they think that it's almost their calling to, and we see this with the United States too, like in the Middle East, it's their calling to bring about solutions to the problems of the world and of the people, right? Um, Okay, but then there's the also, right? In London, around the same time, the British were also promising the Jews, they were promising that land to the Jews with the Balfour Declaration, right? Um, so you promise the Arabs the land, and then you promise the Jewish the land. The Jewish start to arrive in Jerusalem, and then you don't know what to do. This happened with the British. So all hell breaks out in 1929, where the Jewish and the Arabs are rioting, right? And basically the British caused this, right? So I like this documentary because it doesn't try to frost over the British or the British Empire. It goes ahead and asks the locals during the documentary, like, was it a good thing, was it a bad thing that the British arrived? And it also talks about how the British have a certain responsibility, and it's in a way, or partly their fault, that the Arabs and the Jewish are fighting in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land in Palestine, right? So yeah, why promise land, right? Why promise the promised land? On July 22nd, 1946, the militant Jews attack King David Hotel. I think they killed like 100 people or more than that. And there's this woman called Sarah Agassi. Her name is Sarah Agassi. And she explains, she was one of the militant Jews that went in there. And I think they set off like some bombs in the hotel, and they killed Arabs, they killed Jewish, but they killed more Arabs. Their target were the Arabs. So it just talks about the violence that has been going on basically from those times, I guess you could say, basically from 1929, from the riots, or maybe even before that. And it's so interesting because in 1948, the British decide to leave the Holy Land. So this video explains it as their bluff had been called, right? Which is the bluff of them being, all high and mighty and powerful. And he says after more than 200 years of power, the empire having that power, it would be dismantled in 20 years, right? So post World War II, the empire falls. And yeah, I just thought that whole Jerusalem thing was very interesting, because I had no idea that the British had a role in that. And you start to see, like, this documentary is helping me see a lot of things that were happening during those times that were actually influenced by the British, and just how much power and control the British really had during their height of the empire. They call it the Pax Britannica, Pax from peace, paz in Latin, which is a moment of relative peace, which in compared to the United States now, they say that there's no peace. I mean, it's all wars everywhere, with the United States being the leader nation of the world. But when the British were, it was relatively peaceful, because maybe they were focused more on extending this spider web of interconnections and businesses, sometimes even questionable businesses or not so good businesses, but business, basically that's what it was. But yeah, just a lot of things that happen in historical events where the British were actually involved. So I think that was pretty interesting. So I'll get more into it with the next videos that I'm going to be making. I'm going to make 5 of these, so be on the lookout for them. And that's all I got for this one. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.